Have you ever stopped, truly stopped, to notice your breath? Not the kind of notice you give when you're running out of air, or when it catches in your throat during a moment of fear. I mean the simple, effortless breath that's been with you since the moment you entered this world. That silent companion, that invisible gift. Most of us don't. We move through life chasing deadlines, surviving heartbreaks, numbing ourselves with distractions, always looking for the next thing to fix us. And in that relentless pursuit, we forget the one constant miracle happening inside us, moment after moment. Your breath. The soft inhale, the gentle exhale. A quiet reminder that you're still here, still alive, still connected to this vast, breathing universe. I once met a man who lived every day as if life owed him something. Angry at the world, bitter about missed chances. He carried stress like a badge of honor and wore anxiety like a second skin. Until one evening, after a string of sleepless nights and silent tears, he found himself sitting before an old monk, deep in the mountains. The monk asked him just one thing. "Have you ever thanked your breath?" The man laughed, gratitude. For breathing? What kind of nonsense was that? But the monk just smiled, as if holding a secret the rest of us have forgotten. That night, as the man lay alone beneath a sky littered with ancient stars, he did it. He noticed his breath. Noticed the way it entered cool and left warm. Noticed the way his chest gently rose and fell, like the tide of an eternal ocean. And for the first time in decades, he whispered a thank you. Something shifted. Not a grand, cinematic epiphany. Just a quiet softening in his heart. You see, gratitude isn't about the grand gestures. It isn't reserved for birthdays, weddings, or achievements. It lives in the ordinary, in a smile exchanged with a stranger, in the warmth of sunlight on your skin, in the sacred, unnoticed moments between heartbeats. And in Buddhism, one of the oldest spiritual traditions to explore the art of living awake, gratitude isn't simply a polite social ritual. It's a profound practice, a way to open the heart, dissolve suffering, and see the interconnectedness of all things. It's called Kataninyuta, a Pali word that means not just thankfulness, but the deep awareness of all the unseen hands that have shaped your life. The food you eat, the air you breathe, the teachings passed down through countless generations, the love, the loss, the countless faces you'll never meet who made your very existence possible. In every breath, there's a thread connecting you to the world. A silent prayer you didn't know you were saying. A conversation with the universe itself. And maybe, if you're willing to notice, you'll find that life isn't something happening to you, but something happening through you. Imagine waking up tomorrow, not chasing a list of things to fix or achieve, but greeting the morning like a long-lost friend. Feeling gratitude for the warmth of your bed, for the coolness of the floor beneath your feet, for the breath that arrives without permission and leaves without notice. It sounds simple, it sounds ordinary, but perhaps that's where the magic lives, and that's where our journey begins. In this series, we won't just talk about gratitude like it's a trendy hashtag or a bullet point on a wellness blog. We'll rediscover it in ancient Buddhist wisdom, in modern science, and most importantly, in your own breath. We'll explore practices that require no temples, no gurus, no retreats in faraway lands. Only your attention, only your willingness to be present for the smallest, most miraculous thing you have, your breath. Because within that sacred, invisible gift lies the power to soften anger, dissolve loneliness, deepen compassion, and quiet the restless mind. It's always been with you. It's here right now. And it's asking for nothing except to be noticed. So take a moment. Right now, close your eyes if you'd like. Feel the inhale, feel the exhale, noticing, grateful, alive. That's where we start. That's how we remember. And as this quiet awareness takes root, you might begin to sense it that there's more than just air moving in and out of your lungs. There's an ancient wisdom, a connection to everything that breathes, a timeless presence that has been waiting patiently for you to notice. This isn't just about breathing, it's about awakening. And as you gently open your eyes, I invite you to step with me into the next part of this journey. where gratitude isn't something you write in a journal once a year, but something you live in every breath, every glance, every moment you're blessed to witness. There's a story waiting to unfold, and it starts right here. There's a peculiar thing about gratitude. In the modern world, we've reduced it to a polite phrase. Thank you for holding the door. Thank you for the gift. Thank you for the meal. We say it automatically, almost out of habit. But is that really gratitude? Or just manners dressed in borrowed robes? You see, in the ancient teachings of the Buddha, gratitude isn't a transaction. It isn't a courtesy. It's a way of being, a constant, living awareness of how deeply connected, supported, and dependent we are on everything and everyone around us. The Buddha had a word for it, Anāpānasati. Not easily translated, but if you listen closely, it carries the essence of recognizing the debt of kindness we owe to others, and living with that awareness in our bones. It's not about repaying with gifts or favors. It's about carrying that recognition in your heart, letting it soften your pride, dissolve your self-importance, and remind you, you didn't get here alone. Imagine for a moment the countless lives intertwined with yours. The farmer who grew the rice you had for breakfast, the stranger who planted the tree shading you from the afternoon sun, the grandmother who taught your teacher's teacher's teacher to read. We don't see them, we don't know their names, but we live because of them. The Buddha taught that this awareness, this unshakable sense of gratitude is essential for dissolving ego, because the ego loves to claim credit. It whispers, I earned this. I did this alone. I deserve this. But gratitude reminds us that every breath we take is borrowed. Every moment of joy, every kindness received, is part of a web spun long before we arrived. There's a powerful story told in the Buddhist canon about a young monk named Sariputta, one of the Buddha's closest disciples, renowned for his wisdom and clarity. After attaining profound insight, Sariputta didn't rush to boast about his enlightenment. He didn't seek titles or followers. Instead, he quietly sought out his first teacher, the humble wandering ascetic who had first sparked his interest in the Dhamma. Sariputta bowed low before him, not because the man was enlightened, not because he held any official rank, but because without him, the path would have remained hidden. That, my friend, is Anāpānasati, not just gratitude for grand gestures or life-saving acts, but for the tiny, seemingly insignificant moments that redirect the entire course of a life. And here's the thing, Buddhism teaches that it's not just a virtue, it's a practice, an inner training. Like tending a garden, you cultivate gratitude with daily, intentional care. In one of the oldest Buddhist texts, the Buddha says, "These two people are hard to find in the world, the one who does a kindness and the one who is grateful for it." He didn't say wealthy people, or powerful people, or even wise people, the kind and the grateful, because those two are the seeds from which peace grows, and it goes deeper still. In Buddhist cosmology, beings reborn in realms of intense suffering, the hell realms, the animal realm, the hungry ghost realm, are said to lack gratitude. They cannot see beyond their pain, their hunger, their constant craving. But the human realm, precious and rare, offers the opportunity to remember, to practice gratitude, to open the heart even amidst struggle. It's not about denying sorrow or pretending life is easy. The Buddha never taught that life would be painless. He taught that within the impermanence, within the uncertainty, gratitude is a doorway, a way to transform suffering, not by erasing it, but by recognizing the 1,000 invisible blessings that surround it. The morning you wake up with a heavy heart, and yet the sun still rises, the rain still falls, the breath still comes. Gratitude isn't about being cheerful, it's about being awake. It's seeing the bitter and the sweet, the joy and the grief, and bowing to both. It's understanding that the cup may be cracked, but it still holds water. That the road may be long, but your feet can still walk it. That you have not been abandoned by this life. So the next time you whisper a thank you, pause, feel it, mean it. Not as a word, but as a living awareness of the endless, ancient generosity that sustains you. That cup of tea you're holding, the hand you held once in childhood, the stranger's kindness you forgot but never truly lost. This is more than a thank you. It's a way to live. And as we keep walking, let's explore something beautiful, how gratitude isn't just a fleeting feeling or a moral obligation. It's a medicine for the restless, anxious, unsatisfied heart, a balm for the wounds of modern life. And in the next breath, we'll uncover the science behind what ancient sages somehow knew all along. That gratitude doesn't just make you kinder, it makes you stronger, calmer, more alive. Let's breathe into that wisdom together. It begins with a breath, not the kind you barely notice as you hurry through your day, not the shallow, anxious inhale that clings to your chest, but the breath that carries you home, the breath that reminds you you're alive. In the ancient forests of India, beneath starlit skies and under the cool shade of sal trees, the Buddha taught a simple yet profound practice, a way to anchor the mind, a path to gratitude that requires no altar, no ritual, no words. Anāpānasati, the mindfulness of breathing. And while to the untrained ear it may sound too simple, too ordinary, those who have walked the path know. In the rise and fall of a single breath, worlds unfold. Soft, steady notes of a bamboo flute join the ambient background. The Buddha spoke of it with reverence. He called it a direct path to liberation. Because it's through the breath that we reconnect with the present moment, the only place where life truly happens. Consider this. Each breath is a gift no one can give you and no one can take away. It arrives freely, unasked for. It sustains you, whether you remember it or not. It forgives your anger, carries your sorrow, fills your joy. And in this simplicity lies its power. You see, gratitude often feels distant because we think it must be grand. We wait for life-changing events, for perfect days, for the absence of pain. But the breath doesn't wait. It offers itself to you right now in whatever shape you're in, whether your heart is light or heavy. Whether the world feels kind or cruel, the breath keeps coming, and in that there is an ancient kindness. The practice of Anāpānasati begins by simply observing the coolness of the inhale, the warmth of the exhale, the rise, the fall. Without controlling it, without judging it, just witnessing the sacred current of life as it moves through you. And here's the beautiful part. As you watch the breath, gratitude naturally awakens. Because in those moments of quiet awareness, you realize how precious, how fragile, and how miraculous it all is. The Buddha taught that the breath is not separate from the mind. It is the mirror of your inner world. When the mind is restless, the breath is erratic. When the heart is burdened, the breath is tight. But when you soften your gaze inward, when you listen without force, the breath reveals a stillness that was always there. And in that stillness, gratitude blooms. You begin to see how even in sorrow there's mercy. In loneliness there's space. In the simple act of breathing there's a quiet, unwavering support. The breath never asks for praise. It never demands acknowledgement. It serves you in silence. And so you thank it, not with words but with awareness, by noticing it, by honoring it. This is where Anāpānasati becomes more than a meditation technique. It becomes a way of life, a constant remembering. Each breath a bow, each exhale a letting go, each inhale a receiving. And perhaps, just perhaps, this is what the Buddha meant when he spoke of nirvana not as a distant, mystical place, but as a state of deep, unshakable peace born in the present moment. Because the breath brings you here, not to the regrets of yesterday or the fears of tomorrow, but to the unrepeatable, irreplaceable miracle of now. And in this now, gratitude is no longer something you do. It's something you are. A walking, breathing expression of life's quiet generosity. So as you sit or walk or wash dishes or hold the hand of a loved one, let the breath remind you. Let it whisper its ancient wisdom, that you are held, that you are sustained, that you belong. And from that place, gratitude flows without effort. Now, having touched the breath and felt the spark of gratitude it carries, let's step further. Because ancient wisdom has long spoken of gratitude's healing power, not just for the mind and spirit, but for the very cells of your body. Modern science is beginning to catch up, and what it's discovering is breathtaking. In the quiet practice of thankfulness, there's a medicine older than time, a strength hidden in softness, a resilience born not from resistance, but from deep, radical acceptance. And it's time we remember what our ancestors knew. Let's breathe together and open that door. There comes a moment in every life when the pain of the world feels too much, when headlines bleed tragedy, when a loved one's eyes shimmer with silent grief, when your own heart feels too heavy to carry. And in those moments, the instinct is to turn away, to armor up, to shrink from suffering, yours and others. It's a reflex as old as time. But what if there's another way? What if, instead of closing down, you could open wider? Not in helplessness, but in profound, fearless compassion. In the ancient monasteries of Tibet, a quiet practice was passed from teacher to disciple, like a sacred ember. A way of meeting suffering with courage, tenderness, and unshakable grace. They called it Tonglen. At its heart, Tonglen is a breathing practice, but not one designed to escape discomfort. Rather, it's a radical act of turning toward it. Breathing in the darkness, breathing out the light. It begins, as all sacred things do, with awareness. You sit, you settle, you feel the breath moving through you, and then you invite in the suffering, not as a punishment, not to drown in it, but to hold it just for a breath, the sharp grief of a friend, the fear in a stranger's eyes, the ache of your own lost hopes. On the inhale, you breathe it in, not with aversion, but with tenderness, as if to say, I see you, I will not abandon you. And on the exhale, you offer relief, a soft light, a warmth, a silent wish. May you be free from this pain. At first, it seems impossible. Why would I willingly take in suffering? But here's the paradox. The moment you stop resisting pain, it softens. The moment you hold it with compassion, it transforms. Because suffering isn't a weight to carry. It's a call to connect. And through Tonglen, the boundary between you and the world begins to dissolve. You realize the sorrow you breathe in isn't separate from your own. The fear in another's heart beats in rhythm with yours. And in that deep knowing, compassion arises naturally, not as pity, not as obligation, but as an unstoppable current born of recognition. The great masters taught that Tonglen is not about fixing. It's not about heroism. It's about presence, about being willing to feel what others feel, even for a heartbeat, and offering your steadiness in return. As you breathe in, you might visualize the suffering as dark smoke, thick, heavy, and as it enters, the warmth of your heart transforms it like morning light dissolving mist. And what leaves you on the exhale is clear, soft, healing air, a blessing, a balm, not just for others but for yourself, because the secret of Tonglen is that in giving compassion, you receive it. In opening to the pain of the world, you uncover the vastness of your own heart, a heart that can hold sorrow and still sing, a heart that can touch darkness and still shine. And so when you next encounter suffering, whether in the world, in a friend, or in your own chest, you'll know what to do. Sit, breathe in the ache, breathe out ease, hold it all in tenderness. This practice isn't an escape from life's harshness. It's a way to live inside it wide awake, to meet cruelty with courage, to meet loss with grace, to meet despair with an unshaken promise, I will not turn away. In a world starving for kindness, Tonglen is a quiet revolution. One breath at a time, one heart at a time, one act of radical, beautiful compassion. And as you rest in this knowing, as you feel the echo of those ancient Tibetan masters in your own breath, the path opens further. Because when you begin to meet suffering with compassion, a deeper gratitude awakens. A gratitude not for perfect moments, but for the chance to be here, to feel it all, to love anyway. And in the next chapter, we'll walk through how this gratitude does more than soften the heart. It rewires the mind, heals the body, and renews the spirit, a wisdom both ancient and confirmed by modern science. Some truths are ancient, whispered by sages, carved into temple walls, passed down in the hush of twilight meditations. And some are rediscovered in fluorescent-lit laboratories, measured in heartbeats, brain scans, and patient testimonies. Two worlds, one wisdom, gratitude, a word so simple, so easily dismissed as sentimental fluff, but beneath it lies a power both timeless and profoundly biological. Modern science, in its restless quest to map the human experience, has turned its gaze toward gratitude. And what they've uncovered isn't just poetic. It's measurable, it's repeatable, it's real. At the University of California, Berkeley, researchers launched a study asking hundreds of participants to write weekly gratitude letters. Some sent them, some didn't. But those who wrote, even if the letters remained unsent, experienced remarkable shifts. Their anxiety decreased, their depression lifted, their sleep improved, and most astonishingly, the effects lasted. Weeks, even months after the study ended. In another study, neuroscientists at Indiana University used MRI machines to observe the brains of people practicing gratitude. They discovered that expressing gratitude activated regions associated with empathy, moral cognition, and reward. And the more consistently people practiced, the stronger these neural pathways became. In simple terms, gratitude rewires the brain. It carves new grooves of perception, training the mind to see abundance where it once saw lack, to notice beauty where it once saw only routine. And it doesn't stop at the mind. Cardiologists have found that cultivating gratitude can lower blood pressure, reduce inflammation, strengthen immunity, and even increase resilience against heart disease. Why? Because gratitude, quite literally, shifts the body out of survival mode. It soothes the nervous system, slows the pulse, eases tight muscles, and sends a biochemical signal of safety. In a world addicted to speed, to scarcity, to comparison, that signal is revolutionary. And here's the deeper magic. Gratitude isn't reserved for perfect days. In fact, its power is most profound in the midst of struggle. A 2017 study found that cancer patients who kept a daily gratitude journal reported better sleep, less fatigue, and improved mood, even while navigating the brutal landscape of chemotherapy. Because gratitude isn't about pretending everything's okay. It's about acknowledging what is and choosing to notice what remains. The warmth of a cup of tea against trembling hands. The way light filters through a hospital window. The simple miracle of breath. This isn't new wisdom. Buddhist monks have known for centuries what neuroscience confirms today. That to savor a single breath is to reclaim agency over your experience. To recognize joy in the mundane is to resist despair. To bow to what you have, not what you've lost, is to train the heart toward resilience. In the Abhidhamma, the ancient Buddhist psychology, gratitude is considered one of the wholesome mental factors. A state that, when cultivated, leads to calm, clarity, and compassion, not through forced positivity, but through presence. Modern science now measures what those old masters felt in their bones. That gratitude stabilizes the mind. It anchors the spirit, it heals. And you don't need hours of practice, you don't need perfection. You need only to begin, a breath, a word, a silent thank you, even now, especially now. Because every moment you choose gratitude, you shift your chemistry. You reshape your brain. You soften the hard edges of fear. And you step, quietly, courageously, into a life more fully lived. And as you feel this truth settle into your bones, as you realize that gratitude is not a reaction, but a creation, the path ahead opens further. In the next chapter, we'll leave the sterile walls of laboratories behind and step into the living world, into forests, oceans, and starlit skies, to remember what the earth itself whispers, that gratitude isn't only a practice of the mind, but of the senses, a way to awaken fully to the beauty that waits in every sound, every scent, every breath. A single breath, soft, unseen, a simple rise and fall within your chest, and yet inside that moment a story waits. We are all of us storytellers, long before words were written, long before ink met paper or pixels met screens. We gathered around fires, we traced constellations with trembling fingers, we whispered fables in the hush of night, Because stories carry meaning where facts alone cannot. They breathe life into wisdom. They anchor the unseen into the heart. And in this restless age of endless feeds, flashing screens, and relentless noise, a well-told story isn't just entertainment. It's a lifeline. If you wish to share the sacredness of a breath, the quiet miracle of gratitude, you must first shape it into a narrative. A heartbeat people can feel, a moment they can see themselves inside, and the most powerful stories are not always grand. They don't require epic battles or distant lands. They begin with something achingly ordinary. The grandmother who folded your tiny hands in hers and taught you how to watch the sunrise. The night you sat alone on a hospital floor and a stranger left a cup of tea beside you. The afternoon rain that fell like silk over the city while you stood barefoot on cold tiles, feeling the earth breathe. Viral stories live not in spectacle, but in resonance. In a truth so quiet, so raw, that it disarms. It reminds the listener of something they'd long buried beneath routine. And gratitude stories, oh, they're the most contagious. Because in a world primed to complain, to compare, to crave, a story that begins with a simple thank you feels rebellious. It cuts through cynicism like sunlight through fog. When you craft these moments, lean into texture. Let your listener taste the tea. Feel the warmth on their palm. Hear the rhythmic pulse of their own breath in the dark. Use pauses like sacred spaces. Let silence speak, because sometimes the most powerful part of a story is what's left unsaid. In Buddhist tradition, the stories of the Jataka, tales of the Buddha's past lives, have endured for millennia not because of their flawless prose, but because they carry a seed of recognition. A farmer sacrifices for a hungry animal. A prince renounces his palace. A tree offers shelter. Simple acts, immense meaning. Your stories can be the same if you tell them not to impress but to reveal. And here's the secret. Viral stories aren't about you. They're about us. They strike a chord in the collective heart. They remind the weary soul that it's not alone. That someone somewhere has stood where they stand. So when you tell of your breath, of your moment of gratitude, frame it as a mirror, not a monument. Invite them in. Say, perhaps you felt this too. Or have you ever noticed? Leave space for their reflection to appear. And in doing so, you create not just a story, but a bridge, from your chest to theirs, from your breath to the collective breath, from one heart to 1,000. And that is how a single breath becomes a movement. Because a viral story isn't about numbers. It's about impact. It's about the stranger who hears your voice at 3 a.m. and exhales for the first time in days. The mother who listens while folding laundry and remembers the scent of rain on her grandmother's porch. The friend who forwards your video with a simple line, "You need this." You're not chasing algorithms, you're offering medicine, one breath at a time. And as this truth settles into your chest, as you realize that every breath carries within it the seed of 1,000 stories, we arrive at the threshold of our final chapter, where we'll gather these threads, these breaths, these moments of grace, and weave them into a quiet, sacred offering, a return to the self, a bow to the world, not an ending, but a beginning, a gratitude that lingers, long after the words fall silent. And so here we are. A breath ago you pressed play, maybe curious, maybe restless, maybe seeking something you couldn't name. And in that space between inhale and exhale, we rediscovered the sacred hidden in plain sight. Not in temples of stone or ancient texts alone, but in the simple rise and fall within your chest, the cool air that brushes your skin, the warmth that fills your lungs. We've walked together through teachings older than empires, through Anāpānasati's mindful breaths, through the compassion of Tonglen, through stories passed down by monks and mothers, and the soft pulse of modern science quietly confirming what the ancients always knew. That gratitude, real bone-deep gratitude, is not a reaction, it's a way of being, a practice, a choice, a daily act of rebellion against a world designed to distract. And now, as you sit here still breathing, this is not an ending. It's the first step of a new way to move through your days, One where you greet the morning not with complaint, but with a whispered thank you. Where you notice the kindness of a stranger, the warmth of sunlight on worn wooden floors, the small, almost invisible gifts that turn ordinary days into sacred ground. And when life storms rise, as they will, when the heart aches and the road narrows, may you remember this breath, this quiet anchor, this eternal pulse beneath the noise. You have within you the oldest medicine, the simplest prayer, the art of gratitude in every breath. And if this journey stirred something in you, if a memory surfaced, or a tear quietly fell, or even if it was just a fleeting warmth in your chest, I invite you to share it, because somewhere out there, another restless soul is searching too, for a story like this, for a breath like yours. So if you felt seen, if you felt held, subscribe to this channel, not as a number, but as a part of this small, growing circle of hearts. Leave a comment, tell me what you're grateful for today, or simply type "still breathing," and let's remind the world together that even now, even here, there's beauty worth noticing. Because this isn't goodbye, it's a bow, a breath, a beginning. Thank you for being here, for breathing with me, for remembering. We'll meet again in the next story, in the next breath.